What is it that forces you to sit down and write? In my case, perhaps the biggest impetus to my wanting to tell my story, it was when I saw my mother on the street and got together with her later and said, Mom, what the heck am I supposed to tell people when they ask me about you? And she said, just tell them the truth. And it's perhaps the best advice that anybody has ever given me. Because for so long, I tried to run from the truth. But the truth is a squishy creature, and it takes on many shapes. What is the truth? Anybody who has sat down to try to tell a story knows that you can go at it from all sorts of different angles. I'm going to share with you a story that I don't usually tell people. I don't know what it is that compelled me to want to tell this story, but for a long time I was in the closet about my past. I didn't want to tell anybody. It was a deep, dark secret for me. One day I was working late at a magazine, a very snooty magazine, and a friend of mine, she was sort of in an odd mood, and I asked her what was going on with her. And she said that a relative was coming to town, and she was a little bit nervous about it. She said, it's a very dear person to me, but quite frankly, he's a bit of a hick, and I'm worried about how all these sophisticated New Yorkers are going to react to him. And I said, I know how you feel. And she said, how could you possibly know how I feel? You with your Park Avenue lifestyle and your Barnard education, you know nothing about people like me. I was like, okay, let me tell you a little something. And she's perhaps the only person, there's only two people really, well, a few more than that, but very, very few people in New York who I told my story to. And as I told her my story, her jaw literally dropped. She was like, well, I can't believe that. And she asked a few questions. In fact, we ended up talking most of the night about it. And I thought, well, this is sort of cool. I've revealed to somebody the truth about my past, and I haven't been struck down by lightning. Maybe I'll start doing this. The next day I noticed that she was acting a little bit distantly towards me. And I was like, did I say something weird or wrong? And we sort of drifted apart. A couple of years later, I decided to look her up, to see what happened to her. So I Googled her. And she'd written a book. It was a book of fiction. And I read a review about it. And it was about a well-known media person in New York who had a secret hidden past, whose parents were homeless, and she was hiding this fact. So I immediately bought the book off Amazon, and the main character was red-headed and tall, and her name was Ruby Blossom Bottom, and she was from Shoulder Blade, Kentucky. And I read a review about it that said, well, the book is a hoot. It's a lot of fun, but this could never happen. It's just too outrageous. You could never go from backwoods Appalachia to New York City and become a media star. And after that review appeared, there was an interview with the author, and she said not only could it happen, it did happen. This story was revealed to me very late one night by a woman in New York City, a well-known person, and I was so horrified by the story that I stopped being friends with her. But the story really stayed with me, and I felt so compelled by it that I had to write it up. And the greatest challenge in the story was making the main character sympathetic because of this horrible thing she'd done by not acknowledging her family. And so, as I said, I immediately bought the book from Amazon, and it was fascinating to me because she's actually a very talented writer, and she sort of got the flinty New York media gal that I'd become. Like, she got all these mannerisms, and she described the designers that I would wear. You know, my Maud Frizone shoes. Maud Frizone was a hot shoe designer at the time, and that I carried around bottled water and my little snippish comments all the time, and she sort of captured that. What really ticked me off, though, was her depiction of my dad. She didn't get him at all. And because when I told her my story about my parents, who at the time were living in Lower Manhattan, she said, why don't you help them? I said, I've sort of tried to help them, but my father's an alcoholic. So what did she know about my father? She knew that he was an alcoholic from West Virginia. And so I read this description of him, and so I was like, she got it all wrong. This is not my dad at all. She depicted him as this ignorant hillbilly with a poor vocabulary, who was all the time crying in his beer. And the fault is not hers. The fault was mine for not describing it accurately, because this was the sort of the reality that she had heard. So what I'm trying to get around to is, when we write stories, what I implore, the most important thing, I believe, is to write what you know, write what you understand. I cannot really fault this woman for depicting it unfairly, because this was what I told her. When I sat down to write my story, the great challenge was to say, how do I get across these complicated characters? The Glass Castle's not really about me. It's really about my mother and father. And how can I explain to the world this complicated story about these highly educated, highly intelligent people? Why would they be living on the streets? And moreover, what kind of a monster of a daughter would live on Park Avenue and write about celebrities while I was letting my parents live like that? And that is the challenge that writers have. It is to explain a story. When you're sitting down to tell a story, what are you trying to get your audience to understand? You're trying to evoke a reaction in them. Whether you're writing comedy, you're trying to make them laugh, you're doing a college application, you're writing a horror story, you're writing a romance, you're trying to make them understand something or feel something. And in my case, I was trying to get them to understand my story. Even though it is nonfiction, we shape our truths by which stories we tell and how we choose to tell them. Some people who've read The Glass Castle think that my story is a tragedy, that it's heartbreaking. Other people think it's inspiring and comic at times. I wrote the first version of The Glass Castle in 6 weeks, and it was very bad. And that is not false modesty. My bad writing default mode is a very stilted form of journalism. I wrote it sort of like, I'd heretofore not considered the plethora of influences, blah, blah, blah. And when my agent read it, she said, you wrote this as though it happened to somebody else. You have to get inside the story and describe what really happened and how you felt about it, how it affected you. I said, oh, it didn't affect me at all. I'm perfectly fine. And she cited back an incident that I described in the story, and I burst into tears. And it made me see the degree to which I'd sort of distanced myself from these things that had happened to me, and that I used journalism to distance myself from events. So I was then left with the decision, how do I tell this story? And this is one of the challenges that anybody who sits down to write a story has, is you can approach a story from just about any perspective. If any of my siblings had written The Glass Castle, the story would be entirely different without any of the facts necessarily changing. And you have to choose, well, what is the story that I'm trying to tell? So I spent 6 weeks, like I said, writing this first version, which was a mess. I spent 5 years rewriting it, trying to be honest. And among the challenges I had were, well, what is the story? I sat down to write this story. I actually tried to write it a couple of times when I was younger. I tried to write it when I was in my teens, in my 20s, and again in my 30s. It wasn't until I was 40 years old that I really sat down and tried to write it with any earnestness. But I still didn't really know, well, what is the story? What is the beginning, middle, and end? Even though it is nonfiction, and I say this very carefully, so please listen to me very carefully. Even though it is nonfiction, I had to come to understand that you can use the tools of fiction, which is not to say fictionalize it, but that these people in my life have to become characters. They're no longer my brother and sister and mother and father. They are people that I have to explain to readers, well, who is this person? So how do you include enough anecdotes and enough details, the good and the bad? How do you get across the good without whitewashing them, without glorifying them, and the bad without vilifying them? And I think that is one of the great challenges of writing something like a memoir. It has been said that Shakespeare's great genius, I know he can be a little inaccessible with all that Elizabethan English, but I think that one of his great geniuses is that his characters are so complex. The heroes are all flawed, and the villains are all sympathetic. Nobody is black and white. So how do I get across these complicated people fairly and accurately? I could have made either of my parents seem much worse than I did by including some of the stories that I didn't. I could have made them seem better than I did by not including some of the stories. So each detail that you include, it's a choice, it's a decision. And how am I trying to, what am I trying to explain to the readers about these people? And that was a great challenge. And beyond that, like I said, well, what is the story? What is the beginning, middle, and end? I originally thought that The Glass Castle would be a lot more about my New York City years. I thought that there was this sort of neat, funny sitcom quality about living on Park Avenue while my wacky homeless parents were from time to time invading my life. And that part, it just didn't work. And I think I had to write it to realize that. There was one episode during which I had my father on one line and Donald Trump on the other line. And Donald Trump could hear the line. At first I was interviewing Donald Trump and the phone kept ringing and he said, you need to answer that. And so I picked it up, it was my dad, and he said, honey, it's your dad. I got a story for you. And I thought I would impress him. I said, Dad, I have Donald Trump on the other line. And he said, hang up on the money-grubbing son of a bitch, honey. I got a Pulitzer in the bag for you, And I thought, well, this will make a funny story. And it didn't. It didn't. It was too weird. It was like you mushed together The Grapes of Wrath and Sex in the City. And I also wanted to write, as I thought that part of the story would include my New York City years, where my first husband was so incredibly wealthy. He came from this world where everybody had not just a house, but 5 houses, one in, in Paris and another off in, a ski resort or whatever. And there were just so many people in that world who were unhappy, and it was so shocking to me that people with so much money could be so unhappy. At one point, when I was in Barnard, I was befriended by a very, very thin woman, and at that point I was pretty thin myself, and this woman started discussing our eating issues. And she asked me if I had eating issues because of my mother issues. And I thought, well, that's a sort of funny way to put it. But yeah, I suppose so. And then I realized that she didn't eat on purpose, which was bewildering to me. As somebody who had to dig food out of the garbage, well, why would you not eat on purpose? And she said her therapist helped her understand that it was because of her anger at her mother that she didn't eat. And that was bewildering to me. If you're angry with your mother, wouldn't you steal her food? I don't understand this at all. Why, so I tried to write about it, and it sounded like I was making fun of her, and there is nothing funny about an eating disorder. So that is why I say, let her tell her story. Let her describe that issue. Let me describe my issues. The issues of poverty, I understand those. That is my world. And I can explain and convey those issues to you. I cannot write about these issues that I don't understand, because even though there is some truth in what I was saying, it is a half-truth. And that is what caricatures and stereotypes are, is that they're devastating because there is an element of truth in it. But John Steinbeck, he once wrote a satire, and he called up his, before it was published, it was just in manuscript form, but he called up his agent and said, you must destroy this manuscript. He said, my entire life has been dedicated to try to get people to understand other people by telling the truth. And this manuscript looks to incite hatred and ridicule by telling half-truths. And that, again, that is what characters and stereotypes are. And a big mea culpa here, that is what I did as a journalist, as a gossip columnist, is I would go in and it's very funny to it's very easy to make fun of rich, famous people who've got, so much money and so much fame, and then they go off and carry on. But the more I got to know these people, the more human they became, and the more difficult it was for me to write about them and make fun of them. And that's one reason I'm so happy to have stepped away from my former career. Because, in telling the truth, how do we tell the truth? And in my opinion, it's about getting deep inside the truth and being unafraid and telling your stories. And that is why anybody, when they ask me, well, what should I write about? Write about what you know. Write about what you care about. Write about what you understand and what is passionate and meaningful to you. A friend of mine who's Jewish says that the Talmud has a line that says, when the heart speaks, the heart listens. And that's my advice to you, is that when you're looking to write something, go deep inside. Be unafraid. Be unafraid to shine your flashlight in those dark places, because that's where you find your diamonds. And it's very scary at first to oh my gosh, all of these deep, dark secrets. But it's very funny, because once you write about these things, you own them. the whole process of writing is the process of thinking. And when you put your words down, if you are willing and able to be honest and rethink those things and be honest about it, then you can figure it out. A number of people have asked me if I've had therapy to be able to write this book. This book was my therapy, because when you confront these truths, again, if you are willing to be honest, then you come to terms with them. And that's why it took me 5 years to write this story. The greatest challenge, perhaps even before figuring out, well, what is the story, what is the beginning and middle and end, is finding your voice. And that is part of, believe it or not, part of being honest. As I said, my first version, it was very bad journalism. And so I had to make the decision, well, how do I write this story? Do I write it as an adult looking back on what happened to me? Or do I made the decision, the other alternative is to write it from the perspective of a child going through these things. The book opens with me being 3 years old and moves forward. And so I spent that 5 years trying to be honest with myself about how I really felt about these things, what was really happening and how I felt about them, and recalling, well, what was it like to go through these things? What did I feel about my mother and father? I also made the decision not to pass judgment on any of the people or in the situation in the book. And some people have asked me, well, why didn't you do that? Why didn't you describe, what your mother and father were really up to? I made that decision for a couple of reasons. And the primary reason is because as a child, I don't remember passing judgment on my parents that way. As a child, that was my reality. Sort of accept, well, this is what's going on. This is why I feel this way, because this is my world. But moreover, I wanted the readers to draw their own conclusions. As I said earlier in the talk, some people think that my story is horrible and tragic. Other people think it's sort of inspiring. Others think it's hilarious. Book clubs tell me, they said, well, it's the biggest debate ever about your book. I hate your parents. My best friend loves them. Which of us is right? And I tell them, you're both right. It's a matter of perspective, and that's the way it should be. That's the way the world is. Two people can look at the same president, and one person will see a hero, and the other person will see a villain. And I want people to get different reactions having read my story, and I want there to be discussions about, well, were her parents good? Were her parents bad? That, I think that is one of the reasons that we tell our stories, to get people to think about these issues and to discuss them. But the whole process of finding your voice, it's a huge challenge. And like I said, it's part of being honest. And I realize in writing it, the degree to which I use humor to sort of distance myself. Humor and pain live right next door to each other. And sometimes they cross over, and I didn't realize the degree to which I used humor to try to sort of soften the pain. And sometimes the humor didn't work in the book. In fact, my agent pointed out one time, there is a scene where my older sister Lori and my grandmother Irma got into a fist fight. And I wrote it up as a hoot, because I remember it being sort of funny, and they were punching each other and pulling hair, and there were glasses and cigarettes flying everywhere. And my agent said, Jeannette, you wrote this scene up for laughs. It's not funny. Your kid brother was being molested by your grandmother. I said, well, it was sort of funny. You had to be there maybe. So I called up my brother. I said, Brian, remember that time that Lori and Irma were fighting? And Brian said, yeah, that was a hoot. They were like pushing and fighting, and cigarettes were flying everywhere. And he said, now why did that happen again? Somebody was being hurt. And now my brother has this like steel trap memory. He can remember absolutely anything. I said, Brian, Irma was groping you. And my brother, who is a rock, started crying. And it's so interesting to me the degree to which, we use humor sometimes to remove ourselves from pain. So that's part of the ugly process of having to go back and probe at these, at these wounds that we all have, these scars, these dark parts of our lives, where I think that the great jewels for your writing are hidden. But once you write these things down, it's funny because they lose their control over you. But in the process of finding your voice, you have to be honest with yourself about who am I and what am I. My advice to anybody in the midst of really heavy-duty writing is to not read anybody else's work who influences you too much. When I wrote The Glass Castle, beforehand I read a number of memoirs that I thought were good and impressive. And then I made the mistake of continuing to read some while I was working on the process of writing it, including Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes, of course, the brilliant Irish writer. And I noticed that Blarney started creeping into my writing. It's, my wee little brother, it wasn't quite that bad, but the cadence of my language started changing. And similarly with Mary Karr, who of course wrote a wonderful memoir, but she's a poet. She's a very dense writer, very complicated sentences that go back on themselves. And I don't write that way. And I noticed that my writing was being too influenced by her. So when you're looking to write, find your own voice. Don't be too influenced by anybody else. Because if you try to copy somebody else, you will at best be a pale imitation of them. Find the way that you think. Be honest. I personally, and this is my opinion, there are very smart people who disagree with me, I am not a huge fan of really fancy writing. I prefer direct, accessible writing. If you look at the great speech writers of all time, Churchill and Martin Luther King, they used very simple, accessible language, Martin Luther King Jr. said, I have a dream. He didn't say, I possess an idealized vision of the future. It's, I have a dream. Everybody can understand that. Everybody can relate to it. Complicated thoughts with simple language that people can relate to. I don't like writing that draws attention to itself. I like writing that communicates with people. And part of that process is just finding, to open yourself up to people. Be unafraid. When you write, be unafraid of people's reactions. You'd be shocked how smart and receptive people are if you are willing to be honest. And that was one of the challenges with having told my stories. There was so much that I'd hidden, either through humor or through my flinty media gal persona, or just because I didn't want to talk about it, because I was ashamed of it. And when my husband read a very early version of my book, he said, Jeannette, you said that your parents weren't buying food. Well, how did you eat if they weren't buying food? I said, I got by. He said, well, what do you mean you got by? I said, I may do, And he said, no, I don't know. You have to describe what happened. So, no way I'm going to do that. No way. Because I had never told anybody about rooting around in the garbage for food. It was a source of deep shame for me. And I had to write that scene about 20 times because every time that I wrote it was cold. It was just very cold and I was very distant. When I say that scene, I wrote a couple of times about not having food, but there was one time in particular that for whatever reason, when I was rooting around in the garbage at Welch High School in West Virginia, that was very shameful to me. And it's just something I never told anybody about. And when I was writing that scene, after I broke through and it stopped being cold and I started getting real and emotional, I was a basket case. I was crying, and we're not talking about pretty Hollywood tears. We're talking, wet nose, snot slinging. I was a mess. After the book came out, Primetime Live did a segment, and they brought me back to West Virginia, the little town in southern West Virginia, where I'd been raised. And they took me to Welch High School and wanted me to show them the garbage can where I dug out the food, and they wanted me to reenact the scene for the cameras. And my brother was with me, and he said, you want to see the garbage can where I was digging out the food? And I had no idea that my brother was doing exactly the same thing that I'd been doing, but of course he was. But these are the things we don't talk about. You don't go home from school and say, hey, I got myself this really good cheese pimento sandwich. But a very wise man once said to me, he said, secrets are a little bit like vampires. They suck the life out of you, but they can exist only in the darkness. Once they're exposed to the light, there's a moment of horror, but then poof, they lose their power over you. And I found that to be so true because these things that had haunted me and controlled me and chased me for my entire life, they no longer bother me. If anything, I find them as almost a source of strength, or at least of understanding. And that's what the whole process of writing is about. It's about understanding. Whether you're writing a memoir, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, it's about understanding the truth. It's about conveying a truth, whether it's, you're looking for a grant, you're looking to get into college, you're trying to get across an idea. And to do that, you need to be powerful, you need to be honest, you need to be direct, you need to be organized. What is your beginning, middle, and end? What is it that you're trying to do? Again, I am a fan of somewhat simple language. Not always, you can throw in a big word every now and then, but I'm not a big fan of razzle-dazzle vocabulary, because I think it draws attention to the writing, where I think the important thing is the story. The story. And when you find your voice, then the story sort of tells itself. And be honest, be direct, be open, be unafraid, and figure out, well, who is your audience? What is it you're trying to say? What is the story that you're trying to say? Any form of art, and I hesitate to call writing art because it sounds a little self-aggrandizing, but it's all about manipulation of emotions, whether it's a song or a painting or a speech or writing. You are trying to evoke a reaction in your audience. And what is that reaction that you're looking for? Are you looking for somebody to in your college essay, are you looking to have somebody let you into college? You're trying to convince something of somebody, whether it's a speech and you're trying to convince a country to go to war, whether it's a memoir and you're trying to explain to the world, to the people who you didn't explain that well that evening, the people who when I told that earlier anecdote about the woman who ended up writing the novel about me, again, it wasn't her fault. She got a little bit of the story. So I cannot tell my story in a paragraph. I cannot tell my story in a few minutes. I had to write a long, complicated story. And in my experience, people get it. People understand the story because I had the time and the space to explain it thoroughly. If I were just to say, as I did to this woman, yeah, my dad, he's an alcoholic, and they're living in lower Manhattan, they're homeless, I've tried to help and I can't, then that's not the whole story. It's the truth. It's the truth, but it's not the whole truth. So how do you get across a complicated story? You have to, sometimes you have to tell the whole backstory. And that is the challenge of a writer. Sometimes you can do it in a short, in a short little spout. Now, anybody sitting here thinking of writing your memoir, it's a very daunting task. And people say, oh, I don't know where to start, da, da, da. My advice, for what it's worth, is start with a scene, just a scene. There is something in your life that probably plays through your head time and time again. Many people have asked me, how could you possibly remember all those things in that book? How could I possibly forget them? And I've tried it, I couldn't. But write that one scene, and you realize that, memoirs, any story, it's a compilation of a bunch of scenes. So you write that one scene, and then you write another scene, and then you write another scene. And next thing you know, you've got your book. I mean, more challenging for me than writing the individual scenes and recalling the incidents within each scene was putting them in order. I never doubted that I would open with seeing my mom on the streets. Because that was really what gave me the kick in the behind to decide to go ahead and tell the story and then go back and try to explain to people, well, this is what happened and this is how I got there. I wasn't quite sure where to open up. It was my husband who suggested that I open up with getting burned when I was 3 years old. And I said, that was no big deal. I got burned, I got a little scar, but it's, and he said, trust me, that's a big deal, that's a big deal. And he said, now this scene is gonna depend on detail. Write down absolutely everything you remember. And I was like, okay, People have asked me, how could you remember all these things from when you were 3 years old? There are these studies that have been done on memory in the brain, and traumatic memories are stored in a different part of the brain where they're more easily accessible. To put it in layman's terms, they haunt you, and it plays in a continuous loop in your head. So I remember a lot of things from that whole incident. So he said, write down everything you remember. So, okay. So I go write it down, and I show it to him. He said, you can take some of this detail out, Jeannette. That I had too much detail. And so, but the first part of the book is a little bit choppier because there are like gaps. I don't remember this, I don't remember that. But I would not have included anything in the book if I didn't remember it. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how much are memoirists allowed to make up. How much, there's been all this controversy about memoirists making things up, blah, blah, blah. And I get asked sometimes, how much did you make up of the glass castle? I didn't make any of that stuff up. I mean, if anything, I toned some of it down, but I feel very strongly about this. The whole point of writing a memoir, of telling your story, is to tell the truth, is to explain to readers, this is what happened. This is what happened. And once you start mixing fiction in, that you've ruined the whole point. I told the story to explain this is my story of poverty, and whether you're writing about your experience with poverty or the Holocaust or being in a gang or whatever, you're just telling the truth. And once you start introducing fiction, that violates the bond between the reader and the writer, and they no longer trust you. Now, that being said, of course, there's the difference of perspective, and that is the leeway that a memoirist is allowed. My very fondest memory is getting a star for my birthday, a planet actually. My second fondest memory is when a cheetah licked my hand. Now, when my husband read that version, that episode, he said, Jeannette, did this really happen? You went to a zoo, you stuck your hand in the cage, and a cheetah licked your hand? I said, yeah. And he said, are you sure? I said, yeah, that sort of stuff was happening all the time. He said, not to most families. And he questioned me so aggressively. I thought, gosh, is this one of those weird false memories? So I called up my brother. I said, remember that really gorgeous, beautiful cheetah at that zoo that licked my hand, that big muscular? And Brian said, wait a minute, that was a mangy, flea-bitten critter. And we're probably both right. I asked my mom, I said, was it gorgeous and muscular, or was it mangy? And Mom said, well, it was a little bit of both. So that is the leeway that a memoirist is allowed, is you're allowed your perceptions. You're allowed your opinion. You are not allowed your own facts. It wasn't a barracuda. It was a cheetah. Whether or not it was a gorgeous and noble or a little mangy and flea-bitten is a matter of perspective. And anybody, as I said earlier, any of my siblings writing this book, it would have been an entirely different story. I've always been an incredible optimist. To this day, when my brother and I will see an old house, I'll say, oh, that's gorgeous and beautiful, look at that. My brother will say, structural damage going on in the roof there, So, and we're both right. So that is the leeway that a memoirist is allowed. The difference between an autobiography and a memoir is that an autobiography has to be a little bit, if I'd written an autobiography of myself, I would have had to have gone back and interviewed people and tried to be a little bit more objective. But I think that readers understand that, I wrote The Glass Castle from the perspective of a child going through these things. I think there's something that literature professors like to call the unreliable narrator, which means that when you're reading, you understand, a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old thinking, this is so cool, I don't have to use a pillow, this life is great. You understand, this is a little kid who doesn't quite get it. So, so that, again, that is the leeway that a memoirist is allowed. It's sort of like, I'm not lying, but you understand that my perspective as a little girl, my perspective on this life is a little skewed. So that's the leeway that we're allowed, because when somebody reads your story, they want to know the truth. If you feel compelled to start mixing in things that didn't really happen and, gussing up things a little bit, that's fine too. That's great, but you call it fiction. And that's what so much of good fiction is that people are mining their own lives for these emotional truths and these things that really happen to them, but for whatever reason, they're not comfortable putting the real names with the real people, or they feel that the story needs to be adjusted a little. Again, that's fine. If you read about the lives of many, many great writers, you see that they mine their lives for most of their books. Thomas Wolfe and Updike. I mean, these are people who are basically writing about their lives. Farewell to Arms, Hemingway, he wrote the first version of a Farewell to, The Sun Also Rises. He wrote it with the names of the actual people who were involved in the event. I mean, it's something that happened to him, and then he just changed the names and a few of the details. So fiction, a certain type of fiction, is very, very close to nonfiction. I think of myself purely as a nonfiction writer because I have no imagination. I'm no good at making things up. I tried to fictionalize The Glass Castle. I couldn't even think of fake names for us. I used all of our middle names. And whenever I tried to change something, I thought, well, this wouldn't have happened. Dad wouldn't have done this. It's out of character. So I have one little slim talent in this world, and that is sort of ferreting things out. I'm very good at digging and getting deep inside about what happened. I'm incapable of making things up. So I'm not in a position when we're talking about writing here. People like, J.R. Tolkien who make up orcs and hobbits and stuff. I don't know, that part of my brain doesn't work or it doesn't exist or whatever. I cannot give advice on that sort of thing. I only understand nonfiction writing. I only understand writing about what it is that you know, that you understand, that you've experienced. And I do think that that's where a lot of really, really good fiction comes from. It's about these things that you know and understand and that you've experienced that for whatever reason you don't want to write as nonfiction. But the fiction that makes the impact, it does have these emotional truths. I mean, even something like The Lord of the Rings, it was these great mythologies that were handed down through the generations. And also, he was very inspired by what was going on with the Second World War, with the dark forces gathering. So you hit with these emotional truths, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Write what you know, write what you understand, write what you care about, and be unafraid. I'm going to take questions, and please, don't be nervous about asking absolutely anything. I've yet to be asked a question that I find upsetting or embarrassing. Just throw your best question at me. Anybody? Come on, some brave soul, come on. I do have scars. I have both physical and emotional. Yeah, I do. It's funny because not long after The Glass Castle came out, one of the very first reactions to it, I went on the Diane Rehm show, and one of the very first callers said, "I think that's a great story, but I don't believe a word of it." And I was sort of like, "Oh my gosh!" And I did not expect that reaction because it was so difficult for me to tell the truth, and then for somebody to doubt the truth. It's like, why would somebody make that up? If I were to make up a story about myself, I would hope I would make up something that makes me look good. This is all very embarrassing. Nobody would lie about this sort of thing, but people have lied about this sort of thing. But one of the said, "Well, where are your scars?" Well, honey, you're not going to see me walking around in a bikini. I'll tell you that. But yeah, I do have the scars, and it's funny because for a long time, I worried. I'm going to repeat a story that I told last night because it's just it's one of the reasons I think people should tell their stories, because I was so ashamed of my past, and when I was dating this gentleman for a while, and I told him, I need to warn you. I was in a big fire when I was a little girl. I got these nasty scars. And he said, "Why are you telling me all this?" I said, "Well, don't want you behind a pig in a poke. I'm sort of, And he said, "Don't ever apologize for your scars." He said, "Those scars are a sign that you've survived and that you are stronger than whatever it was that tried to hurt you." And I said, "I just wish I was nice and smooth like everybody else." And he said, "Smooth is boring. You've got texture. Texture is interesting." And I thought it was, and I ended up marrying that man. He's my husband. And I thought it was just an incredibly wise thing. But somebody told me something I thought was even wiser, and that is this very well-to-do woman said, "Sweetie, there is no such thing as smooth." She said, "You look close enough, silk has texture." So sometimes, we all have scars, and some are visible, some are invisible. And I think the whole process of writing is coming to terms with that. It's your scars, it's your texture, it's your story, whatever you want to call it. We all have things that we've endured and survived. And if you go around ashamed of these things, then they haunt you. If you're able to sort of look at it and be unafraid and just sort of realize it's something I went through. It's sort of, it's not that it's no big deal. Of course, it makes you who you are, but at the same time, you're not a prisoner to it. It's something that happened to you. And if you're able to confront it, then you're able to write about it and put it to use for you, and it's funny, like I said, it used to sort of haunt me, and blah, 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 but it doesn't bother me anymore. It's something that happened to me. Anybody else? Yes.
So when I read Glass Castle, I adored it. I loved your writing style. I just thought it was phenomenal. Completely made me want to start reading other people's memoirs. And you mentioned earlier a couple of memoirs that you read, but what other memoirs do you think are worth reading, or that you that stand out in your mind?
A memoir that I like a lot is This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff, and it's sort of funny because not a whole lot happens, but I think that some of the beauty in it is what doesn't happen and what he doesn't say. It's a very understated book. I love memoirs. If somebody's willing to be honest, I'll listen to just about any story. I even love the not good ones, because sometimes somebody won't come out and say what's going on with them, and I'm like, "You're ignoring the story." This is, so they need to write another version. I have a friend who was writing a memoir, and she has this amazing story about this father who was a polygamist, and she didn't find out about it until later, and she took 12 years to write her, and she left out father stuff. And there was this great big hole in the story because of it, because she had this incredibly complicated life as a reason, but she wasn't able to look at what was really at the center of her story. But I just finished another one that I just loved, and it's called Life is So Good. It's about a gentleman who learned to read at age 98. And I thought it was so inspiring. I read another one that, and this was a tough one, called Memory Palace by Mira Bartok. And I actually blurbed that one, which is when those little things on the cover where you sort of like loved it, couldn't put it down, blah, blah, blah. But it's a complicated, and I wouldn't recommend this without reservation. Part of the problem with memoirs is you can't always recommend without reservation because somebody's going through some things and sometimes they haven't completely come to terms. But this was a lovely, very dense, very poetic, The Memory Palace. I thought it was lovely. But I like I said, I'm a big fan of memoirs, and I'll just read about anything. Do you have your hand up here? No. Yes. Uh-huh. What is my religious affiliation? I'm a deeply religious, sort of spiritual person. So my dad was sort of coming around toward the end. I think he sort of saw the light toward the end, but I'm a religious person. Yes. How's my relationship with my sister and brother? My older sister is still in Manhattan, and she's still a writer. She was a little ambivalent about the idea of my writing this book. Not that she would have ever tried to stop me, but she finds the past very painful. She is, you know how I said I'm incapable of making things up? Lori is incapable of writing nonfiction. Anytime that she starts, she's a big fan of Tolkien, and anytime she tries to write something that's true, it just jumps the track and goes into fiction, So she loves science fiction and fantasy, and she just sort of, and that's the way her art is as well. When we used to sit down, and my mom would give us art lessons, and we'd paint a jug, I'd sit there like trying to paint the jug to look like it looks. And she's got these purples and greens everywhere. Da, da, da. So she's just very creative. And I think that people's brains work so differently. And I've just always been somebody who colors inside the lines. I'm a rule follower. And that's why I think I'm a real nonfiction writer. But Lori is just sort of, she sees the world differently. So that's, but she's been fine with the book. She's been great about it. And our relationship is good. My brother and I are very close, always have, and we talk a couple of times a week. He's the one person I showed the book to while I was writing. I offered to show it to everybody in my family while I was working on it, and nobody, except for my kid sister, because I'd lost touch with her, and my father, of course, is dead. But my older sister and Mom had no interest in reading it while I was working on it. Mom only read it once it became a bestseller. Lori's fine with the book. One of the many wonderful things that's happened as a result of having told my stories that I'm back in touch with my kid sister, who is living in California, and she was also fine with it. And that's something I really struggled with in writing the stories, because I had the permission of everybody in my family to write it except for my kid sister's story. And anybody trying to tell your story will find that is the great challenge. It's one thing to expose your story and expose yourself to possible humiliation or whatever you think is going to happen to you. It's another to do it to the people you care about and to tell their story. And I think it's important to tell it with their story with compassion without necessarily whitewashing them. But Maureen's story is much more complicated than mine. And she does have a whole story that went on. And I really wrestled with, how do I tell this story? And ultimately, it was my editor who said, Jeannette, this is her story, not your story. I thought it made an interesting parallel to mine, but she said, you're really bogging yourself down with this story. That's her story, you tell your story. So, but Maureen is fine with the book as I wrote it. She's living in California still. She's not setting the world on fire with her career, but she's living in a clean, safe place. I've actually been trying to get her to come live with me in Virginia, but she says she never wants to live where it's cold ever again. Any other questions? Yes. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. I'd actually sort of forgot to get into the half-broke horses. As this gentleman has pointed out, after all I've said about memoir writing and the truth, I started getting pressure from my agent and editor to write a second book. And I don't have another story. I just have my one story. And as I said, I can't make things up. So I needed somebody to write about, somebody or something to write about. And I talked to a couple of people about potentially interviewing them, and every time I'd start interviewing them, they'd say, oh, well, you can't write that, that's too embarrassing, leave that out. But it was readers who kept on saying, I want to know more about your mother. They said, I understand your father, I understand alcoholism, but your mother is a mystery to me. Why would somebody with a college education, who has resources to lead a somewhat normal life, why would she choose the life of chaos that your mother chose? So I tell them a little bit about my mother's childhood, how she was raised in a 180,000-acre ranch in Arizona. And it was pretty much rural-free. But then she was sent off to a boarding school that she hated. She also had a very domineering mother. And I feel that much of her adulthood was trying to recapture the freedom that she had as a child. And inevitably, these people's faces would light up. Because I think that memoir readers, they're not looking for a freak show. They're looking to understand. They're looking to understand what the seemingly inexplicable. And so they say, your next book should be about your mother. And at first I resisted the idea because I thought, well, didn't I sort of tell Mom's story in The Glass Castle? But I guess I didn't, if people are still bewildered by her. And one of the reasons I'm drawn to nonfiction is the answer's always there. It's always there if you are willing to dig deeply enough. You might not like the answer, but it's there. So if people are bewildered by Mom's behavior, I didn't do such a good job in explaining. And perhaps the reason is because I don't think I fully understood. So I approached my mother about, well, how would you feel about my telling your story? And she was all for it. Oh, that'd be great. And I got to hand it to Mom for all of her loopiness. She was great about being interviewed. My mother lives with me in rural Virginia now. And she never held back anything. She was just telling me the story. What about this and this and this? But she was the one who, while I was writing it, she kept on saying, this book should not be about me. It should be about my mother. She's the one who led the truly interesting life. And at first I resisted the idea because my grandmother died when I was 8 years old. I remember her very vividly, but I don't know her story. I knew a couple of stories that she'd told me, but I wanted to write a nonfiction book. I wanted to write it in the voice of the protagonist. And I knew I couldn't interview my grandmother, so I tried to write the book initially about my mother. And I was going to tell my grandmother's story as the backstory. But I found that the backstory indeed was more interesting. Lily, my grandmother's story, really was more interesting than my mother's. And the backstory was sort of weighing down the story. And my mother, for all of her loopiness, and she's a sort of passive person. She didn't really do all that much. Whereas my grandmother was this she broke horses, she sold hooch, she was a gun-toting, card-playing, horse racing school teacher who just she drove the school bus and was all the time getting stuck in the mud, and she'd get the kids out and have them push it out, and she'd make them pray while they were pushing, and she'd say, push and pray, kids. I mean, she's just this incredible character. She was a school teacher when she was 15 years old. She hadn't yet graduated high school, and for her first teaching job, she had to ride a little pony 500 miles through the Southwest to her first teaching job, and she thought it was no big deal. In fact, she didn't even mention it until my mother, until they heard a radio report about somebody riding 350 miles on a horse. She said, well, that's no big deal. I did that a couple of times when I was 15 years old. So I ended up making Half-Broke Horses, not about my mother as it originally intended, but about my grandmother. And I tried to write it in her voice, which I remembered very distinctly, even though, as I said, she died when I was 8 years old. But I call the book fiction, even though I used almost entirely what my mother told me. And it is as true to life as I could possibly get it, but I couldn't double check all this stuff with my grandmother because she's dead. I did get some records through little articles and things, and most of what my mother told me checked out. There were certain facts that conflicted a little bit, how her grandfather, who was a big deal in the Mormon world, how he got killed, was some issue of dispute. The report said that he was killed by a Navajo, but Mom said some rival Mormons killed him. And I said, well, what about this one? And she goes, that's the lie that those Mormons were spreading. Blah, blah, blah. So I was left with the dilemma that any historian is left with is you have these conflicting reports. How do you present them? Now, as a memoirist, that's not an issue. You have your perspective. This is what I remember happening. But when I was reporting on somebody else's life, especially since I'm reporting on Lily's life, and I couldn't get her perspective, and I couldn't very well, I'm writing first person in Lily's voice. So how do I report on these conflicting reports? I decided to just go with my mother's version of what happened. And since I'm not double checking it and trying to, verify the accuracy, I went ahead and called it fiction. We used the label a true life novel, which I wasn't out there trying to genre create or anything like that. That was actually something that was used to describe Norman Mailer's Executioner song about the Gary Gilmore case, the And he wrote that almost entirely from court transcripts, but he took a few liberties with what really happened. And God bless, Norman Mailer, he said, once you start taking those liberties, it's no longer nonfiction. Now, there are people in the publishing world who urged me to call this nonfiction. I'm like, I can't call it nonfiction. I wrote it first person from somebody who's been dead for 40 years. And like, oh yeah, but it's all based on the truth. No. Once you start like making up thoughts about what's going on in this woman's head and writing in first person, that's fiction. Now, some people have said, oh, it's going to confuse the readers. They're not going to understand. Is it fiction? Is it nonfiction? Readers are smarter than folks in the publishing world seem to think. They totally get it. This is just a family story. It's my grandmother's story, and sometimes my great-grandmother's and great-grandfather's story, as was passed down through the generations. And I tried to get it as close to the truth as I could. But since there was no way I could verify some of the things, and again, since I wrote it in first person, I just called it fiction, and most readers get that. It's anybody in this room, I'm sure you all have family stories, and if you were to sit down and write them as, this is what happened, well, you don't know that because you weren't there. You don't have, especially if it was from, not your parents' story, but a dead ancestor. Well, this is the way it was told to me. Then you have the choice to either write it as an historian, say, the facts conflict on exactly what happened. And I felt that to write it that way would have sort of taken the reader out of the storytelling quality. And I wanted it to just be a story and not a history. So again, I made the decision to write it as fiction. I think we're just about up with time. So if anybody has any last minute questions, yes.
What's the best advice that you've received and just give out to everyone else?
The best advice I ever received was from my mother when she said, just tell the truth. And again, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, that is my advice to you. You can change the names, but go for those truths. Go for those emotional truths, those scary realities that sometimes you might want to turn because it's so overwhelming. But that overwhelming emotional quality is what readers are looking for. I don't know if I have time. Do I have time? I have a few time. Yes. Okay. Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you.